Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the British Institute at Ankara. My name is David Logan. I'm the chair of the Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening for a panel discussion which some of you may find familiar as regards the title, and indeed the participants. As regards the title, I think the key thing, of course, is that within the year that's passed since we last had this panel meeting, a tremendous amount has happened. I sadly couldn't be here this time last year, but I said to the panelists, I bet the word ISIS wasn't even mentioned, and they agreed with that. I hardly need to introduce them, as Jeremy Paxford says about University Challenge. However, on my far right is Minister Yaşar Yakış. He was an extremely distinguished Turkish diplomat. He was ambassador to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia, to the UN offices in Vienna. He then became, he was then a founder member of the AKP, the current governing party. He was foreign minister. He was a two-terms member of parliament and head of the European Committee. On my right is Rosemary Hollis. Professor Rosemary Hollis is Professor of Policy Studies at City University. She's an expert on the Middle East who I'm sure you've all seen on television and heard on radio. Before that, she was Policy Director at Chatham House. And on my left is John Peet, who is the Europe editor of The Economist and is a well-known expert on Europe and also on Turkey. Before that, he was, I think, The Economist representative in almost everywhere that mattered, Washington, Brussels, and so on. As I say, he is not only, well, he's a European in the sense that he's thoroughly inclusive of Turkey. So I'm going to ask Minister Yakış to speak to start with, then Rosemary, and then John.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David. Is it working? Okay. In addition to what you said, the changes between last year and this year, I think there are also changes between the time you decided on the title of this meeting and today, because at that time, the ISIS or ISIL or Daesh, whatever we are going to call it, it existed, of course. Its ancestors existed since 1999, but it did not exist the way it exists today. That's to say, threatening the entire balances and the security and the stability in the Middle East. For this reason, I would like to begin with the ISIS. What is it? Without entering into details, because we will leave more time to the question and answer period, and we will do our best in order to answer your questions. We will draw perhaps an outline of what the situation is. Regarding the ISIS and the Turkish connection with it, of course, Turkey has become more aware of the threat of ISIS only after the Turkish embassy in Mosul was seized by the ISIS, and together with 49 of its staff members. At that time, most probably, from the statements of the public authorities, they did not think that ISIS will go as far as seizing the embassy of all countries, of Turkish embassy in Mosul, and the difficulty that the government ran into in order to secure the release of the staff members. We do not know what type of bargaining may have taken place. Perhaps it will never be released. But the international press and media said that certain ISIS members who were in Turkish jails were released as a quid pro quo for the release of the Turkish hostages. At present, Turkey, having understood the size of the threat, is trying to distance itself, but this time there is another side effect of the ISIS presence. Those who joined ISIS later on may have crossed Turkey when Turkey was not taken too seriously the transit of the border, because at the beginning Turkey was trying to let those recruits of the moderate opposition in Syria, and later on it turned out these moderates were not that moderate, and some of them joined Salafis and Jihadis, and of course they also joined ISIS. At the time when Turkey was not taken seriously to that extent, they may have benefited of Turkey's perhaps loose border control. Why it was loose? Because there is an agreement, visa exemption agreement between Turkey and Syria. So Syrians and Turks can cross the border on either side. For this reason, the border control was not carried out as meticulously as it should have been done. But this does not justify the criticism directed to Turkey for having contributed to the emergence of ISIS. It may have contributed without the will of Turkey, but ISIS was going to emerge whether those who crossed Turkey to join it were to join it or not. It was going to emerge, it had already emerged, it was going to be strong, but it wouldn't have become that strong, perhaps, if Turkey was to take the measures not to let cross the border. But there is something that the countries from which these fighters were coming, especially the Western countries, shouldn't have authorized in the first place these terrorists leave their country rather than criticizing Turkey. So there is a lack of coordination and cooperation between the Western countries and the third countries and Turkey, but these mutual recriminations do not lead us to anywhere, so we better leave it, and at least from now on, we should continue to cooperate. This is as far as ISIS is concerned, but there are, of course, other dimensions now. The fight between Kurds and ISIS in Kobani left Turkey in front of very unpleasant dilemma, because if Kurds emerge victorious from this fight between ISIS and Kurds, then this will have positive effects on the Kurds' kinsmen in Turkey, where Turkish government is negotiating for a deal between the PKK and their leaders in jail in Turkey, in order to extend perhaps more cultural rights to Kurds. If the Kurds become victorious, then they are likely to raise their stake in these negotiations, so Turkey has difficulty on this side. On the other side, if ISIS becomes victorious in Kobani, it's again detrimental for Turkey's interest, because ISIS is going to establish on the other side of Turkish border, on the Syrian side, with all negative consequences, among them Turkey's assistance to the moderate Syrians will not reach them because it will be under the control of ISIS. This is as far as one part of the Kurdish question and its link with the ISIS is concerned. But Kurdish problem as a separate issue continues to be very important in Turkey. It has become all the more important after the need of the international community to find good fighters against ISIS, and the Kurds became the best suited people, or Kurdish fighters, Peshmerga, better suited fighters against ISIS, because ISIS is threatening their land, their natural resources. Rather than sending the Guatemalan soldiers there, of course, Kurdish fighters would do the job much better. This is at least the raising stakes of the Kurdish cause in the international agenda. But of course, there is another domestic dimension of it for Kurds, because the government is negotiating with the PKK a deal. And this deal has become more critical because of the forthcoming elections in Turkey. Before the elections, Turkish authorities want to get the more votes from the Kurdish electorate. And this cannot be achieved, of course, if you do not give more rights to Kurds. So it has become more complicated, and it still continues that way. And perhaps until the elections, if some sort of agreement could be reached, it will be a step forward in solving Turkey's domestic Kurdish problem. A long distance is covered, and it will be a pity. It will be pity if the distance which is covered has become useless. So I still hope that there are prospects for an understanding, and this will be achieved. Regarding Turkey's relations with Syria, which was the main subject of last year's meeting, it continues to be difficult, but it has become worse. At that time, I used to say that every option in Syria is worse than the other. Today, it is even worse, and Turkey refuses to re-establish some sort of channels of communications with the Syrian authorities, whereas the international community started to think that if the Syrian regime is brought down without setting up a workable substitute, then Syria is likely to fall into deeper crisis. This is, Turkey does not seem to have understood, I mean, Turkey does not share this opinion, and still Turkey gives the first priority to bringing down the Assad regime. If Turkish relations with Egypt was better, then a chance of success could have existed, because without cooperating with Egypt, one cannot do much in the Arab world. Egypt is a very important country, and by cooperating with Egypt, it could have been done easier. If Egypt opposes to a solution, I believe that it's almost impossible to achieve whatever we think there. And Turkey now, in the year 2015, at a time when the future of the Middle East is going to be designed, Turkey has no ambassador in 4 most important Middle Eastern countries. It has no ambassador in Cairo, no ambassador in Damascus, no ambassador in Tel Aviv, and no ambassador in Libya. Of course, this makes Turkey's task more difficult. I will stop here, and perhaps we can elaborate further after the very valuable contributions that Rosemary and John will make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much. When some of us were in Istanbul last November, we heard from President Erdogan that Daesh, IS, was principally a Western creation through a series of mistakes. I decided to take seriously that contention. Supposing there's some truth in it, what can I find? And what I want to offer, so as not to duplicate the Turkey experts on the panel, is something about a sequence of what I think were Western European or European misunderstandings that have brought us to a position that if there is to be cooperation on resolving the massive problems that are tearing apart the Arab world, not mentioning the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if there is to be some productive cooperation, it would be as well to understand how we got here. And I'm going to suggest to you that there were a series of 3 major disappointments in terms of European expectations of Turkey and where Turkey would fit in with their plans. The expectations have, since the 1990s, or at least when Turkey became a candidate member of the European Union, have been framed in accordance with the candidacy. That is, for the Europeans, Turkey was expected to become progressively more and more like them, more and more like a member state of the European Union. And the onus has been on Turkey to make all the changes, not on a convergence of EU and Turkish norms, institutions, and practices. This logic has set the scene for European disappointment in the way Turkey has evolved under the AKP. This has been more acute because Erdogan appeared to be taking Turkey on a path which would indeed make the country, Turkey, more and more like other Europeans or EU states in his early period. But then that trajectory was interrupted or morphed into something else, which looked to Europeans both A, more avowedly Islamic, and B, more autocratic. So this is disappointment number 1. Now, disappointment number 2. Another dynamic was at work also, especially in the context of Turkey's rapprochements with its Middle Eastern neighbors, and then its initial stance, and then the Arab uprisings of 2011. Some Europeans, notably the British, started talking about Turkey as a model for its Arab neighbors, combining both Islam and democracy, secularism and private faith. Implicit in this hope or vision was a recognition of Turkey as simultaneously, recognizably like us, European liberal capitalist democracies, and different in culture, heritage, and faith. In fact, such differences were both welcomed by some Europeans as useful to Europe. Turkey would be the bridge to the more pronouncedly different Arab Muslim societies to whom Europe could delegate management of the difficult neighborhood in the Middle East, Europe's southern neighborhood. And at the same time, this same difference about Turkey was used by other Europeans to explain why Turkey could never become a full member of the European Union. Too Islamic, not European enough. Clearly, it's a problem to reconcile the two dynamics. Turkey as more and more like us, the Europeans, Turkey as different, and whether that can be valuable or not for Europe, it cannot be the same as us. That's disappointment, or if perhaps better named, confusion, number 2, about what Turkey is supposed to be to the Europeans. And disappointment number 3 derives from something else that was going on during the period that takes us up to 2 years ago, I would say. The European member states were meantime not desisting from pursuing their own agendas, quite apart from Turkey, in the Middle East. And in the way the Europeans and the Americans handled the uprisings, the challenges in Egypt, Libya, and then Syria, have succeeded in complicating matters. That, at least, I think we have to concede, have succeeded in complicating matters in the region. We've got chaos in Libya and in Syria, a proliferation of armed factions in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, massive refugee flows, and the emergence of Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, to the point where Turkey is deeply affected and potentially destabilized by both. So what is disappointment number 3? Why is Turkey being so churlish about confronting Islamic State and not following the Western line on dealing with the phenomenon? And the disappointment on the Turkish side is, do the Westerners, the Europeans, the Americans not see their role in creating this mess, of which we are feeling the major brunt in Turkey? Now, I would argue that it's incumbent upon the Europeans to recognize that we, the Europeans, including the UK, and Turkey, therefore, got to where we are together. And so there should be no notion of seeing a problem in the Middle East, which Turkey is in the front line and therefore has to bear the brunt of solving. We're in it together. Stop looking to Turkey to be different or to act differently and to take the blame, and start discussing where do we go from here in a more magnanimous fashion. And if Iran can be part of the solution, so can and must be Turkey. And I close by suggesting consideration of one of those contact groups that involves all the neighbors having to face the fact that they're pulling in different directions, plus the Americans and the Europeans.
Well, thank you, and I agree very much with Rosemary on 2 things there. We're in it together, and also that it's not usually helpful, I think she implied this, to look for who's to blame for the mess in whichever country you happen to look at. Often both Turkey and the West have contributed. The difference, of course, when we say we're in it together is Turkey has to be in it because it's there. And I think the fact that Turkey is in this region is one of the reasons why it's so difficult. And indeed, I detect that as one of the three threads that I see in Turkey's difficulties in the Middle East, the fact that it lives in what some Turks used to say to me was a bad neighborhood. And not surprisingly, if you live in a bad neighborhood, it's difficult to pursue Davutoglu's favorite policy of zero problems with the neighbors, which I have to say has not been a great success in the last 10 years. But the second thread, I think, is partly also a place where the West has been a bit negligent, partly because I think many Turks, including many in the government, feel that the West and in general and Europe in particular has been less than friendly to Turkey in the last few years, particularly the European Union. I think they have, not surprisingly, turned away and looked at the neighborhood to their south. And you can call this, if you want to be negative a bit, neo-Ottomanism. If you want to be positive, you can talk, as the British did, as Rosemary said, of a model. Turkey is a successful economy and a stable democracy. And many people after the Arab Spring perfectly reasonably said, why didn't you look to the Turkish example? And I think that meant that Turkey was going to want to play a bigger role in that region than it did in the old Kemalist tradition of always looking west. The third thread, again, both speakers have touched on this, is the revival of what we at The Economist used to call mild Islamism. I'm not sure what mild Islamism means, but we always use this phrase to describe the AK party. I have to say we've dropped the word mild quite often recently. But it clearly translates into sympathy for Sunnis everywhere, including in Iraq, sympathy for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Libya. It's fueled part of the opposition to Assad in Syria. And it's contributed to an increasingly negative view of Israel. And so I think that's an important thread that I see in Turkish policy in recent years. And I think, don't want to repeat what Yaşar said, many of these things have come to a head, if you like, blown up in the issue of Syria. I'm not convinced now, looking back, whether Turkey made a mistake or not in calling so vehemently for Assad to go. I think there was an element of feeling that they had been wrong-footed in Libya. And so when it looked as if Syria might follow, they wanted to be out there early and say, we agree, we want to get rid of the dictator. But whether it was a mistake or not, they are in a very difficult position now. America and Europe, I think, in both cases, somewhat negligently, failed to pursue their earlier threats to be more active in supporting the opposition to Assad. They half encouraged Turkey to go in itself, which I think would have been disastrous. And then, when ISIS comes on the scene, there is definitely a perception all round, which you're seeing more and more in recent weeks, that in many ways ISIS is more of an enemy than Assad is. And if that's your case, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And I think that is putting Turkey in an extremely difficult position. Because, in my view, correctly, they think Assad has been a disgraceful president of Syria in the past few years, and they find it much more difficult, therefore, to see the Western view that actually ISIS is the problem and not Assad. And I see the makings now of the West actually working with Assad against ISIS, which I think is regrettable. As Yaşar said, I think this all came to a head with those pictures of outside Kobani, and many people I spoke to said they could not understand how Turkey could sit there with its tanks overlooking Kobani and do nothing about the fact that the people of Kobani appear to be being massacred by jihadist fundamentalists. To try to explain the dilemma that Yaşar just outlined of, well, the Kurds fighting there are very closely allied with the PKK. We have difficulties with the PKK. We are in talks with the PKK, but if the Kurds win too much or too obviously, it may increase the demands of the PKK inside Turkey. It all sounds very mealy-mouthed, and I think actually, even at the time, but certainly in retrospect, I think it was unfortunate that Turkey dithered for so long. They should have allowed American planes to use Incirlik. And I think now it would be a huge good gesture if Turkey made a big effort to help rebuild Kobani, the Kurds having recaptured it. In other areas, I do think the role of the Kurds is critical here. Turkey does have a very good relationship with the KRG in northern Iraq, which may be on the way to becoming a fully independent country. within the next decade. And I think that if that happens, I think Turkey should be willing to accept it and still have good relations with it, and try to do it in such a way that it doesn't, as it were, cloud their own internal peace talks with Öcalan and the PKK. And I do think it's absolutely imperative for Turkey that those talks continue and are brought to fruition. And I hope they're not being pursued just because of the June 7th election and because they're hoping for Kurdish votes, either directly for the AKP or they hope the Kurdish party itself might support a change of the constitution to move towards an elective presidency. I think peace with the Kurds is essential for Turkey, and it's been one of the things that they have. Actually, this government has been much better than any predecessor, but it still has a long way to go. So I put that very high up the list of what needs to be done in this region. And then I'll just finish with two other thoughts on where Turkey goes in this very difficult region. We've heard about Egypt. I mean, relations with Egypt, obviously critical. Egypt is the biggest country in the region. Very difficult for Turkey partly because of their, as I call it, mild Islamism. They identified strongly with Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Turks, quite rightly, were highly critical of the coup against an elected government, which many Western countries even refused to call a coup. But the fact is that Sisi is now in charge, and I think some way needs to be found of mending fences with Egypt. And I'd say the same about Israel. As Yaşar said, we were mentioning this before, I think it's extraordinary that Turkey should be in a position where it has no ambassador in Cairo, Tel Aviv, Tripoli, and Damascus. And I might add Yerevan and Nicosia. I mean, that's 6 places in that region where Turkey doesn't have proper full diplomatic relations. And if Turkey wants to play, as I think it should, a constructive role in this region, it's got work to do to mend that. And the one I would actually single out most of all is indeed Armenia. 100 years on would be a very good moment at which to complete the process that was begun by Abdullah Gül and reach a relationship with Armenia where both sides can be a little bit more harmonious. Solving the Cyprus problem is perhaps more difficult. And finally, on where Turkey goes in all this, I do think, having covered the country for 10 years, that it's very important that people recognise the significance of Turkey, and I think they do everywhere. The Americans certainly recognise it, and I think the Europeans do, and so do the Russians. It is a member of NATO. It's worth restating all the time that. It is a democracy and a relatively successful economy. But I think it would also be a mistake for Turks, and I think particularly of the president when I say this, to believe that they can stand alone. I think they are much better off continuing to look westwards. I do think that Turkey needs the continuing aspiration to join the European Union, and the European Union has behaved disgracefully in this respect over many years. But I think that aspiration is a very important one for the future of Turkey. The Turkish economy, which has been successful, is more vulnerable than I think many Turks appreciate, and we've seen what's happened to the currency recently. And I think there are legitimate worries in Turkey and in Europe about the ambitions of the president, his hopes of having an executive presidency after a change of constitution, his majoritarian instincts, his hostility to criticism, and some of what Rosemary was saying about his autocratic tendencies. So I think the best approach is that Turkey should continue, despite playing a role in this tricky region, to see itself as part of the West more than anything else. And I warned David I might mention the word Ukraine at the end of this. I do think that Russia is part of the dilemma that also faces Turkey. As a member of NATO, I think Turkey is obliged to respond to Russia. The president of Russia has been absolutely clear that he considers himself almost at war with NATO, and he said that he regards the Ukrainian troops fighting in their own country against rebels. He said that he regards them as a foreign legion of NATO. Now, if that is the language that is coming out of Moscow, it seems to me that Turkey's position ought to be clear. They are against Putin because they are a member of NATO. And when we talk about closer relations with Moscow, or even the building of a pipeline to Turkey, I think that they should remember which side they are on.
Thank you, John. Well, thank you all to our speakers. I don't want to take up time because I'm sure lots of people will have lots of questions. I would like to ask, I think perhaps Yaşar to start with, though. Here's a really abstract, hypothetical question, Yaşar. Do you think that Erdogan, in his first 4 years, I mean Erdogan as prime minister in particular during the first electoral period, would have handled things in the neighborhood, in the Middle East, in the way that he is handling them now?
Actually, one of the reasons why I did not run for the third time in the elections is that the ideals that motivated me when I was invited to become one of the founding members ceased to exist. Therefore, I thought that it is better not to be part of this new policy, because, I mean, to be founding member and having served as foreign minister and not to be influential on the decisions that are being taken, then people will ask, why on the earth you are still there? So, of course, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. As the AKP grew stronger, it thought that it is entitled to disregard the criticism, at least some of the criticism which is direct to it, and we have arrived at the point where we are. But despite this, democracy is democracy. So if the electorate gives mandate to the government, then the government will continue to do what it feels appropriate. I think that this answers your question.
We have a roving microphone. Would questioners please wait till it comes to them, not because I doubt the strength of your voice, but because all this is being recorded, and we need a microphone for that post. One here. Chair.
Well, I thought that was a fantastic analysis, and thank you very much for that. I just wonder if, I mean, having spent some time gathering news in the Middle East, and I know one of the problems in reporting news from the Middle East is you get a minute and 30 seconds to explain a multifaceted issue. And I wonder if that impression is allowed to persuade politicians in Europe in particular that it is a simplistic thing and that it's ISIS versus the Assad regime, or it's, you know, the Kurds versus the Sunnis, or whatever it is. These sort of simplistic notions. And I wonder if those simplistic notions get into people's minds when they're forming policy and think, oh, it's dead easy, all we've got to do is sort this out and that's it. And they ignore the fact that it's multifaceted in the way that you've described.
Who's going to answer that question?
I'll have a go. You want to? Well, you raise a very big subject. How is it that these decisions, which turn out to have not been very appropriate, get made? And all the research in politics shows us that, first of all, we're all human, and when a situation is complex, we reach for some way of framing the situation which is going to give us a logical way forward. And we do that on the basis of our upbringing, our experiences. There's a real danger if you're a leader of a country and you've just been through a crisis. The same thing applies in industry, in business. If you've just been through a successful merger or takeover, you learn too many lessons from that previous experience. I was astonished when the British were so gung-ho about intervening in Libya. I thought if we learned nothing from the experience of Afghanistan and Iraq about you bite off more than you can chew, and look what happens. And they learned simplistic lessons. They learned the new government. First of all, by definition, it was a new government, a new prime minister, and he couldn't possibly be like the last one. Secondly, we now have the UN go ahead with Libya, and we have the Arab League go ahead, so we won't be making that mistake. Thirdly, we're not going in on the ground, and we're not going to remake the government. So it'll be all right. That is a perfect illustration of what you're talking about. They reached for some simplistic lessons, they addressed them, and they left the rest to fate. But I don't think this is because of inadequate advice. I don't think that it is a problem that can really be solved, to be perfectly honest.
And I mean, just on reflecting on that, I mean, there is a danger sometimes of always learning the lesson from what you did in the past. And I think the lesson at the moment is don't intervene anywhere, because it always tends to go wrong. And perhaps that's true, but there's a risk if you then conclude you should never do anything at all. And I also do think that my publication actually has a policy of simplify and then exaggerate. That's what we are told to do. But then we're a newspaper. I do think there is often a tendency for people far away to see things as very simple for those on the ground. And I'm particularly minded of the period when the Americans were saying to the Europeans 10, 15 years ago, it's so simple. Why don't you just let Turkey into the European Union? You could do it tomorrow. And they didn't. They appeared, even in the administration, to have no grasp of the complexity of admitting a country to the European Union at all. They thought it was like sort of joining a club. And things are often more complicated.
To which I was a serving diplomat at the time. To which our response was, why don't you admit Mexico to the Union?
What John says regarding the difference between looking at something from a close distance and from a long distance is also valid. But there is also a difference between when you look at it as an academic and as somebody in the politics. This is what I learned, especially after I got involved in politics after the age of 65. And there, for a politician to carry out, to implement what it has in mind, he has to be elected first. And if you want to be elected, sometimes your short-term interests overwhelm the long-term interests of the country.
One there, it's first one. Michael. Wait.
I agree with John Peet that the European Union, he said, behaved shamefully during the noughties, particularly in regard to negotiations on Turkey's membership. I think that the EU, and I have a big personal stake in this, I thought the EU was not really negotiating in good faith because of the ban on negotiating many chapters of the acquis communautaire by Sarkozy, the continuing difficulties with Cyprus, and the foot-dragging or the lack of enthusiasm shown by Angela Merkel. And I think that this helps to explain a change of mood, not only in the public, from, say, 70+% of the public in favor of membership down to about 52 or 3. And I'm sure it affected Erdogan and his rhetoric. During this period, if I may just explain a little more before my question, I will ask a question. The European Union support for accession on a year-by-year basis, as it were, like moles burrowing under your garden, what we call the pre-accession funds, amounting to about €750 million a year, continues, and if I'm not wrong, continues now to flow into Turkey to prepare Turkey for membership of the European Union. This is now quite a lot in the past decade. It adds up to a lot, and a lot of training and a lot of preparation by different ministries. My question is, given the stakes we have now in the need to bring Turkey and the EU closer together, not only over the Middle East, but in terms of Ukraine and NATO and so on, if you see any possibility of the EU having another look at this and thinking we really ought to crack on with these negotiations, focus more attention and put some oomph behind them, show that they're working, because to some extent they are working. They haven't been dropped. They're costing us a lot of money, but nobody's getting any payroll out of this at the moment.
Well, you go first. Let me go first very briefly. I'm afraid the answer is no. My answer is no. I mean, Juncker was fairly explicit when he arrived as European Commission President. He slightly recanted afterwards, but he clearly meant it. There was going to be no possibility of enlargement under his presidency. I don't think public opinion in places like Austria, Germany, or France has shifted significantly. I don't quite draw a causality between the behaviour of the EU and its shilly-shallying and failure to open chapters in Cyprus and all that, and what happened in Turkey post-2011, because I think I just don't think it quite works like that. But I think what has happened in Turkey since 2011, Gezi Park, everything else, and now the prospect of a new constitution, is merely only reinforcing the views of those in the European Union who say, really, Turkey was never a proper candidate for membership, and it's moving further away from the Copenhagen criteria. And to cap all of that, the continuing euro crisis and continuing worries about the eurozone economy, and indeed the European Union generally, I think means the appetite for any enlargement has really gone, with the partial possible exception of the Western Balkans. But those who used to talk about the day when we might admit Ukraine, that's completely off as well. I regret it, but I just think that's a fact.
Can I respond also to the point about decision-making in democracies and having to win office? First, what we are seeing is a competition, I think, across the Middle East between autocrats and populists, or a combination of the two, some of them calling themselves Democrats because their power rests on popular support at election time, what we saw with Ahmadinejad in his first election. And Minister Yaşar can comment more on what the power base is of Erdogan, but it certainly comes from the electorate. And, you know, the strongmen, be they of the Saudi variety or of the Sisi variety in Egypt. And I think the Europeans would be behind the current, behind the tide, if they tried to revive a conversation about democratic regimes in Arab capitals, or to tackle Turkey on whether it's drifting away from democracy. Because in the current situation, in the landscape of the Middle East, it's extremely dangerous. There are all but a few states do not have total sovereignty over their territory. Some states are broken completely. The conversation about democracy has to step back and be preceded by survival. And if all the experts, as opposed to the governments, say that we will not succeed in dealing with IS, or it will be replaced by another version, unless there is an alternative vision, an alternative platform to galvanize support around. And that's where the difference of Turkey would come back into its own. Let's envisage an Iraq, or what used to be Iraq, a Syria, or what used to be Syria, and the people there, in some way that promises them some of the things that neither democracy nor dictatorship have so far brought them, let alone Islamic State. But we're not doing it.
Actually, I believe that there are more implementable things that what we are discussing here. But I will begin with what Michael said. Michael was on the record to say, when he was representative of the EU in Ankara, that all the way from Senegal to Central Asia, the European Union, Turkey was the only country that did not benefit from the European Union's financial assistance, all the way from Senegal to Central Asia. Fortunately, and he said this when he was in office, and fortunately today we are getting pre-accession funds, and we are using them appropriately. And also, despite all these negative connotations and negative voices raised here and there, at the technical level, Turkey's accession process continues unabated. That's true. And now I come to what I said at the very beginning. Turkey's expectation is not as ambitious as it is voiced here. Turkey wants to use the process of accession, the accession process to the European Union, in order to put more order to its interior, to its kitchen, to make Turkey a country where fundamental rights and freedom are enjoyed by more people, and that better functioning democracy, because we are not paradise of democracy in Turkey, and the more transparent market economy, which will reduce the corruption, etc. So if we achieve all these things, whether Turkey joins the European Union ultimately or not becomes irrelevant, or not irrelevant, but not that much important. And Turkey may come to a stage where, after the European Union opens the door, may say, thank you, Europe, we do not want to be together with you. We want to preserve our independence or autonomy, and we would like to become like Norway. This is also Britain, and we will see whether it will. This will solve several problems at the same time. The Kurdish problem today is, if Kurds are given the rights which is being negotiated, Turks will also benefit from it. Because the Kurdish problem at present suffers from the absence of full fundamental rights and freedom. If they are there, if the European Union political criteria are implemented, are applied, then part of the problem will be solved already because of this process. So we have to look at it from this standpoint also. Turkey's expectation is not as ambitious as it is voiced here. Thank you.
Question there. Backwards first, and then 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. I guess I was thinking that the one threat that maybe we haven't touched on much so far is the humanitarian threat. Turkey's obviously been incredibly generous in its hosting of refugees and the like. But I was wondering how sustainable the panel felt that was for Turkey in light of the social and economic pressures that the level of migration and refugees was having.
Good question.
The figures which are mentioned so far is that Turkey has already paid something like $4 billion for the refugees alone. When we say refugees in the camps. But the bill is not confined to this. Turkey lost its bilateral trade with Syria. Turkey lost its trade routes that went through Syria to the Middle Eastern countries. Now this trade route had to be diverted from with the Ro-Ros from Iskenderun. First it was to Port Said and cross the channel, Suez Canal, but now the Egyptians are also creating difficulties, so it had to be diverted to Haifa and overland to the Red Sea and continue, which raises, of course, the freight to exorbitant amounts. And the Turkish businessmen operating in the Middle East were already operating with small margin of profit. So when it is lost, we are going to lose the entire market. And we do not see any end to the crisis. And the difficulty of Turkey is to cooperate with the international community in order to alleviate its own problem was perhaps based at the beginning to the wrong assumption that I think John mentioned, that the Syrian regime was going to fall very soon, and then we should take the liberty to turn off or cut off all the channels of communications. Whereas as a person like me who worked in diplomacy for 40 years, you may disagree with the regime, but you may still maintain chains of communications, and you could become more influential if the channels of communications are open. We have done this with a Maliki regime in Iraq, and it worked to a certain extent. We were not entirely successful, but it worked. We disagreed on his sectarian policy, but we continued our relations. So we should have done this in Syria. Now the future looks not very promising, and I don't see any way out. The reason why Turkey refrained from cooperating with the international community was that the way the international community wants to conduct the assistance to be extended to the opposition was different from what Turkey was perceiving. So this was the beginning of the disagreement. Now Turkey tries to mend it and involve the international community. But once the trust is lost, it is, of course, difficult to make it. But it is coming slowly. Thank you.
The question, of course, is what role can Turkey play? I'd like to, if I may, ask you to talk a little bit more about Iran. I don't quite understand why Iran is backing Assad. I would have thought that with Turkey's good relations, or reasonably good relations with Iran, it's in Iran's interest to work closer with Turkey, even if Assad has got to go. In long term, there must be a much greater benefit for that to develop for both countries. And the other question is, a lot of these jihadists, or whatever they are, the worst ones seem to be actually expatriates, unfortunately some from the UK, Jihadi John and those people. Why doesn't Turkey close the border and monitor the borders a bit better than they do?
Thank you very much. With Iran, of course, Iran has bigger stakes in Syria. When I submitted a report to the then Prime Minister Erdogan on the Syrian crisis, first thing I told him, Turkey was claiming that we are determining our policy in light of the global universal values, and this is why we were taking the side of the opposition rather than the government. And in my report I said, it is not realistic to expect that Russia and Iran give up their national interests in Syria for the sake of universal values.
Or Western values.
Western, well, we regard in Turkey Western values as universal. But Iran, of course, especially after the departure of the United States from Iraq, they filled the gap created by U.S. departure, despite the fact that Turkey, as an ally of the United States, had to be able to fill the gap. It was Iran because brick by brick they made the wall, and when Americans were gone, without firing a single shot, Iran was there. So Iran had entered, Iran has extended its zone of influence already to the Syrian border. Iran has already a presence through Hezbollah in Lebanon. So the only missing link for Iran to extend its influence all the way to the Mediterranean was Syria. So it didn't like to, there's no reason why it should give up. Secondly, of course, if the crisis or the rebellion or whatever you call it in Syria succeeds, then a country which is close to it, because it is Nusayri, Alawite, and close to Shia, instead of Muslim Brotherhood or Sunni majority rule, which may not be in good terms with Iran. Despite this, Iran proposed cooperation to Turkey, and Turkey accepted it, but the way they perceived the cooperation was not to the liking of Turkey, so this cooperation could not be implemented in the field in Iraq. But of course, one has to admit that Iran is the rising star of the Middle East. It has a population of 80 million inhabitants. It has the nuclear technology, whichever way it's going to be contained. It is an oil-rich country. It has a statehood tradition of 2,500 years. It has a very strong diplomacy. Iran should be part of any equation in the Middle East. If it is not there, then this equation may not work.
Bill, I think you're probably our last question. Wait a second.
I think the main problem for Turkish foreign policy makers right now is the serious lack of clarity of Western and particularly American policy. We simply don't know what their end game is, and indeed whether they've got one. The real worry, I think, in Ankara is that the Obama administration is almost entirely concerned with dealing with ISIL in Iraq. And if, for example, in a year's time it managed to defeat ISIL in Iraq, it would be quite happy to go home and leave Syria to itself. And indeed, there is even the worry on the part of some people in Ankara that the Obama administration is prepared to cut a deal with Bashar against ISIL rather than join the coalition against him. I know Secretary of State Kerry from time to time says, oh yes, of course, we don't like Bashar either, etc., etc. This is put on as an afterthought. But the real worry, I think, in Ankara is that the Western powers, and especially the United States, would be prepared to completely ignore the situation in Syria, provided they have the situation in Iraq under control. That's their conception. Second point, which Yaşar Yakış might like to comment on, I think a crucial issue will be the state of play with the negotiations between the government and the PKK, which will probably hot up as we get nearer to the election. Now, if they manage to cut a deal with the PKK, this will lead the PYD in a very seriously isolated position. And indeed, it will be interesting to see whether part of the deal will be for the PKK to approach the PYD, with whom they still have quite close relations, and try and get them into the general anti-Assad coalition. Now, this, of course, would mean a complete reversal of the situation, of the policy which PYD has had up till now, because PYD has virtually been an ally of Assad in northeastern Syria. But I'd like to ask Yaşar, Yakış, or anyone else on the panel if he thinks there's any chance of turning the PYD around and bringing them into the coalition against Assad. Thanks very much.
Actually, I believe that there is, and unlike what you said, the deal which is being negotiated with PKK in Turkey covers also indirectly PYD. Because Salih Muslim, who is the leader of the PYD, cannot contradict something that Öcalan, the leader in jail, will agree to. He cannot contradict it. So if this Kurdish opening, what we call, it is called democratic opening in Turkey, it's a good title, but we, among ourselves, we call it Kurdish opening. If it succeeds, it will solve several problems in Turkey. It will solve Turkey's Kurds problem. It will solve the problem of the government of Turkey, which is the centennial problem. I mean, it is there since 1830s, 180 years. It will solve Turkey's problem with the KRG in Iraq, because they are nestling there. And it will solve also the last problem that you are referring to with the PID, Turkey's problem with this northern Syria. So it will solve several problems, and for this reason, I hope that the distance which is covered in the solution of Kurdish problem will not be missed for the sake of, because of the over-ambitious demands that will come from either side. But you also raised the question of the ISIL, the American focus on Iraq. Yes, but it is also the public opinion in the United States to get to withdraw, to disengage from several things where American decision makers in the past have committed unnecessarily America so deeply. America cannot disengage itself from Iraq because they are the ones who messed up everything, unlike in Syria. So they feel lesser responsibility in Syria. And also this is related to another question that you raised and I did not answer. Why Turkey cannot close the border? But Turkey does not want to close the border for several reasons. Because Turkey wants to continue to support the mild or moderate opposition in Syria. Actually, I don't think that by arming them we are doing the best thing, because I see a contradiction between sending more arms to a country for the sake of reducing the death toll. If you send arms, it is going to be used to kill either a person from the side or from that side. And ethically, I wouldn't be able to explain that we are sending these weapons, but they are not going to be used to kill the opposition. They will be used only to kill the supporters of the regime. So it is justified. Ethically, you cannot say this. Thirdly, when you send arms, let's put ourselves in the boots of the regime soldiers. They besiege the village. They know that the people, the civilians in that village are armed. Are they going to be more ruthless when they know that they are armed, or when they know that they are not armed? So by arming people, we are exposing them to harsher repression. This is also another dimension that has to be taken into consideration. If that many arms were not sent to Syria since the beginning, can we pretend and explain or say that the death toll would have been that high? most probably it was not going to be that high. So it is sending the arms which caused that, the high death toll, and I cannot explain to myself the logic of it. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I think we probably have to draw a line at this point. I mean, I think our speakers have brilliantly brought out the complexities of the situation, and I mean, I think the proposition that, you know, 1,000 miles away we greatly oversimplify has been brought out wonderfully. I mean, if I was going to add another point, I would say that in this discussion, people have used the continued existence of somewhere called Syria and the continued existence of somewhere called Iraq as desirable and feasible policy objectives. But you might equally well say that the Sykes-Picot regime is over and discredited, and that to aim for their continuation as state entities is unfeasible. But I think
we want Kurdistan instead.
Oh, we want Kurdistan instead. So, first of all, I'm sure you'd all like to join me in congratulating our three speakers on a wonderful evening. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, it was really great, and of course, meanwhile, you can prepare your questions for next year. But meanwhile, what you all really deserve is a drink, and that's through there, out of that door and through the other side. Please come and join us. Thanks so much. Thank you so much. It was great. It really was great.
Are you all right? Oh, the edge of the platform was not there. I thought you were flying off the edge of the platform.